Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to Insurance for the New Possible, a Chubb conversation. We are joined today by Isabella Carvalho, the digital head oversees general insurance at Chubb, and Hena Mehta, a co-founder and CEO at Basis. We're doing it. Thank you both for coming. I really appreciate it. Hena, let's start with you, and can we get a little bit of your background for some context?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in India, in Bangalore, left to go to college in the US. So I went to UPenn, computer science engineer.
Wow.
My first job out of college was at Goldman Sachs in New York. I started my career bang in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis.
Well done.
So it was great to have front row seats to all the mayhem. Software engineer, building applications for the trading desks, transitioned into a cross-functional product role within Goldman, was there for half a decade, decided the Indian startup ecosystem was too exciting to be missing out on, so FOMO drove me back to India. I worked with this young fintech startup called EasyTap back then.
Right.
This was in 2014. One of the early hires there, spent 2 years building payments products in India. Very different, moving from a 30,000 something company to a 30-person company. And then went back to the US for business school. I was at Wharton for 2 years.
So you went back to Pennsylvania,
I went back to Philadelphia.
Yep.
Spent a good chunk of my life there. And also spent a little bit of time in the Bay Area with Square on the lending team. So it's now called Square Loans. And decided that India was where I wanted to be and build, and went back this time with a hypothesis around women and money, some of which were driven off of my own pain points as a 20-something, early 30-something-year-old trying to figure out how to pay for business school, which is not a small amount of money.
Right.
And I didn't want to take on a large student loan at the time. So long story short, saw an opportunity, moved back and decided to start Basis.
So a couple of things for me, if you don't mind. When you went to Penn and into Philadelphia, had you even visited before?
No.
Right.
So that was my first time in the U.S.
It was your first time in the U.S., so you just literally got on a plane. So you applied to Penn, you got in, so great. You get on a plane, you go to Philadelphia, which is nothing like Bangalore. Like
Correct.
really nothing like Bangalore.
Correct.
Right? Were there surprising things for you?
As a 17-year-old, yes, absolutely. I think the good thing was that I was sort of prepped for it.
Okay.
I have an older sibling who had studied in the U.S.
Okay, fair enough. So you weren't going completely blind.
I wasn't going completely blind, although now that I think about it, I don't know why I didn't visit her when she was there.
Right.
But yes, very different culturally. But again, the best learning experience of my life.
For sure.
Beyond like the academics and all of that.
Yeah. So you said you had FOMO. What was the type of information that you were getting about the Indian startup ecosystem, and where were you getting it from?
Yeah, so this was back in 2012, 2013, when Flipkart, if you've heard about it, a large e-commerce player in India, was sort of an early stage startup, poster child of the Indian startup ecosystem.
Now owned by Walmart.
Yes, now owned by Walmart.
This is Binny Jindal?
Sorry?
Who's the founder again? Binny Jindal?
Binny Bansal and Sachin Bansal.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess that was sort of the first success story. Lots of exciting things happening. A good friend of mine from Penn actually moved back and started a company in the healthcare space. And I remember talking to him, and he said, do you have $30,000 in savings? I was like, I think so. He's like, just move back.
Right.
And just see how exciting it is to build in this market. He's still a good friend of mine, and he's doing well. And so those were the triggers. My parents, of course, were like, well,
what are you doing?
You're in the U.S. And my parents paid for my undergrad, and
Right.
they're like, well, why do you want to move back here, right? But I saw it, I think, opportunity, and like I said, a lot of FOMO, and I wanted to be part of that growth story, and decided to take that leap of faith.
Okay, I want to jump into this. You said you had a thesis about the finance in relation to females and women.
Yes.
First of all, where did the thesis come from, and what was that thesis?
Sure. So, like I said, some of my own pain points. So when I was applying to business schools, I had thought I had checked every single box. Great recommendation letters, awesome essays, a good GMAT score.
Right.
But when I finally got into one of the top schools in my list, I realized I hadn't planned on how I would pay for it. Right.
You mean just making the remittance, or just like the format of the payments, or
no, just $200,000. Like, where was this money going to come from? Right. And it's not a small amount of money. I was, I think, 28 at the time. And I had a good chunk of time to actually invest and save. And I was at Goldman, and I was making a decent amount of money. But it never struck me that I could be doing this to realize my goals.
Right.
And an MBA is obviously, it's a life goal, it's a career goal, but it's also a financial goal.
Absolutely.
And that sort of worried me, right? And like I said, I didn't want to take on large debt because I wanted to start a company post business school.
Right.
And taking on debt meant I would have to go in for a job that I may not really like, but I would have to do it to pay back.
Yeah, and instead of investing in you'd be investing in paying back interest and principal on this loan that you took out.
Exactly.
And that could take years to pay off.
That would take years. And so long story short, I liquidated my 401k. Thank you, Goldman. And so I wiped out my retirement, not wiped out, I invested my retirement savings into my MBA.
Interesting.
And I took on a small loan, something I knew I could pay off without any stress. And my family pitched in a little, but that experience stuck with me, right? It was just one of those things I could have planned if there was awareness, if I don't know, talked about it with my friends, and it just didn't happen. And so my hypothesis was that young women are not thinking about this at all. And as a passion project, I had started the Lean In community in Bangalore.
Okay.
This was back in 2015. It was a community I started for selfish reasons because I realized I wasn't meeting women, who were, sort of like working women and women in, chasing their careers and stuff. And so I started this community and sort of just validated that this was actually a widespread problem. Women who are independent, who value the independence, who are well educated, well exposed, still are not managing their money the way they should be doing.
And why is that?
I think partially, quite honestly, of course, we have a different cultural background, but I think it applies across cultural backgrounds. We don't learn that at home.
But is it an active thing that happens at home? Like, I'm trying to remember if my mom and dad, they were terrible with money to begin with, right? It's just another story altogether. But were there conversations at home anyway? You mentioned earlier you have a brother, yeah?
Yeah. So I think the conversations at least I had at home, I was fortunate enough to have a mom that worked.
All right? Yeah.
And she was a single mom, so this idea of women working has always
Wasn't new
been
to
in my
you.
mind.
Right.
It's being independent and working was a must and was something natural. However, talking about money has never been natural, which is a very different thing. One thing is saying you have to put effort into things and you have to become independent. And then you're going to have money. But the idea of money as an investment was very different. Was money a bit like as a cash flow, You're going to work, you're going to have this cash, you pay for your expenses, then you start over again the next cycle. But that idea of growing your pot of money, of saving, of investing, of having assets, right, has never been a conversation.
Yeah, and I think very similar for me as well. Like, save money, save for a rainy day, don't spend more than you make, those sorts of things, which are valuable lessons, but it's not about growing your wealth for the long term.
So how do you address that? Right, because you can't get into everybody's family. And that's where at the beginning, like when you're 12 and 13 years old, this is where you start to form your ideas around money, whether you can talk about it, whether you can't talk about it, whether you should just be building for cycle to cycle, or whether you should be taking even just a little bit off the top and putting it into like a 401k or buying ETFs or whatever it is, right? But you can't do it. You can't get into everybody's family. So how do you affect that?
Right. So it is very hard, right? There is a lot of, both learning and unlearning that needs to happen.
Right.
So at Basis, what we did at the very beginning, we focused on financial education and communities, right? So the community part actually worked brilliantly. And we had to make sure it was a safe space, women only, etc.
So what does that mean? You just outreach to people? Like, how do you build that community from scratch?
So our original community was a Facebook group.
Okay.
Right? A closed group. We would approve every member.
Okay.
Before that, we'd actually started another group where we didn't, as an experiment, where we didn't, it was open to all, right? We didn't restrict who could join. Men and women were joining.
Okay.
But men would just take over the conversations, right? And then women were passively consuming, but again, feeling
a little intimidated. Like, maybe I shouldn't ask that because I'm going to feel silly.
Exactly. Like, and there were topics around like leverage. And I was like, this is not even relevant for a layperson to start investing, right? Like things like that. And so then we converted this group to a closed women only group. And that's when the floodgates just open, right? So I think having a set of peers, people who are like you, going through similar challenges, and feeling safe and comfortable enough to be able to ask even what you may think are silly questions. And so I think the community angle plays a big part.
Can I ask you this? What has to happen, or does it have to happen, for that group to then end up being open? For the women to come out of that group and think, you know what, I don't have any silly questions left. And actually, I've been pretty comfortable asking silly questions now. So I'm just going to go out into the greater community and continue to behave the way that I do inside this community. Does that even need to happen? And if it does, how does it happen? Do you know what I mean? Because I don't get the sense that with you, you're going to sit in a room with a bunch of guys and just let them take over the conversation. That's a compliment. I mean that seriously. And you as well, right? Because you feel confident enough in the things that you believe, and you know that there are things you don't know, and you're just going, how does that work? But how does that have to happen?
Yeah, that's quite honestly a very difficult question,
so.
right? Because again, we were talking before we were having that conversation about the way we were raised, right?
Yeah.
Raised to please people, raised to put yourself in a position that is not necessarily a position of power, right? It's a more passive position. And I think across many emerging countries, when I talk to girls that have been raised in emerging countries, we have that same upbringing. So I think it's about awareness first and confidence that, yes, I can add value, right?
Yeah.
And then this is how you enter into the room with more confidence. But I think from an investment perspective, right? And I absolutely echo what you said. The importance of groups are closed, because I think a lot of us, because we didn't learn that at home, we started working, we didn't plan for it that much. You feel guilty. You're like, oh my God, look at the amount of money that I have in my savings account. I should be doing something out of it. Yeah, inflation is crippling, right? But at the same time, you perhaps don't feel you have the right knowledge to do what you have to do, or you don't have time to be managing your investments. I mean, who to trust? So I think there are a lot of different questions that also, because of perhaps guilt or shame, I say, I don't know it, I should know it, that it's much easier to exchange in closed groups. But to your point, I think as we get more educated, as time passes by, and talking about money becomes natural, not a taboo,
right?
Then this change will happen naturally.
Yep, I agree. We need to normalize these conversations. And I actually don't think money is one of those things where you learn a little, you get that little bit of confidence and you're set, right? It's a continuous,
For
it's
sure.
through your life, it's through retirement, and it's important to talk about it.
I want to ask both of you this, and it's in completely different context, right? So you started and you're building your own business, and you both must understand this idea that, because you mentioned this, right? It's not just doing one little thing and then knowing everything, but isn't it also the case that doing nothing is like the worst decision? Do you know what I mean? You said you have all this money saved, not you in particular, but you have all this money saved, and you feel a little bit of guilt of like, shouldn't I be doing something with it? But how do you convince, again, let's go back to a 12 and 13-year-old girl, like a young girl, that doing nothing is the wrong thing, that you'd rather make a mistake and learn from it? And I kind of wish somebody had taught me this. I kind of figured out I played sport when I was a kid, so just watching the ball go by was useless, right? But how do you convince and teach people that? Because the education is really important here.
Absolutely. So yes, I think educating children about risk is important.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate though that mistakes are more expensive for women, right? You're not allowed to fail.
Why is that though?
I don't know. I think it's just benchmarks are different. Like standards are different for women. You have to do a lot more to prove yourself.
That's
and
correct.
if you fail, that's looked at, I guess, I mean, failure in general is hard, but I think for women, the risk of making a mistake is is more, and therefore you stick to safer things. And then that continues with anything, whether it's career risks, whether it's financial risk. So I think that needs to be taught early on, like take risks. And the whole point of risk is, yes, you could fail. It's high risk, high return, but also high risk, you could,
But even you're talking about like playing sports, right? Because typically women, they're like together. If they're playing sports and there's one girl that is hurt, we stop the game. Oh my God, poor girl. We come in that community. We're against the risk. We're against the suffering. If one boy gets hurt, the other ones are there. Bah,
Get off the pitch.
Kick off the ball. Continue. Right. So you were taught to be competitive. You are taught to win. You're thought, okay, I fell down, but I'm gonna get up and go. That's not the way we're taught. So I think there is still a systemic issue that is related to that. Of course, we cannot always say, okay, it's because the way we were raised.
Right.
However, there is an aspect of that we have to consciously be working against, right? Because we were already raised like that. We already have this background to be able to change. And I think the first point is, okay, we have a safe space. We can be there. We can exchange. We can understand. From that space, we get more confident. And then outside of this space, then we can flourish.
Yeah, fair enough. I want to ask both of you this too. Can you, and maybe I can start with you, Hena, right? Can you give us an overview? And I think I understand like the reasons why this has happened, but why and how financial services have historically overlooked women's needs and female consumers, and try to give like some examples, right? We were talking about this before we started recording, just the simple life journey.
Yep. And
I don't mean simple in that life is simple, but in the journey is just completely different.
Yeah. So this is no fault of anyone's, right?
Yeah,
Men have historically been the owners of wealth. And so the industry has been designed for men, right? Of course, it's a one size fits all space. And I think that's changing. But we often say it's a one size fits all men.
Yeah, but
right?
can we say this, and maybe this is really controversial? I'm going to look at it from an American lens, right? I was born and raised in the United States for the most part. Until really the mid-1980s, right? Women weren't even really fully in the workforce.
Right.
For whatever reasons. We can argue about that offline, right?
And in some countries, they're still not.
Right. Yeah. But that's my point. So that like when everybody that was working was mostly men,
right,
they'd get together and design financial services, and they were just sitting around a room with a bunch of other guys going, what do we want to do here? What do we want to do there? And then by the time like the first two generations of women entered the workforce in the United States, it's now 2010.
Yeah.
Right. So you're in the perfect place now.
Right.
To fix this.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's data bias that creeps in everywhere.
For sure.
There is a ton of blind spots.
Yeah.
Right. There's actually this book called Invisible Women that talks about not specific to financial services, but how the world is designed for men.
Yeah.
Right from like office temperatures, right, to cars. Like I drove a really tiny compact car in India, and I would have to be like, it wasn't built for my size, right? And of course, maybe women weren't driving as much before, and who knows? But there are blind spots, and the type of data that's going into making product decisions or how services are rendered to customers hasn't ever taken into account data about women, and I think that's changing. And to your question around like, what does the life of a woman look like, right? So starting from, income patterns, right? We were talking about it. They may look a little bit more checkered for women because we may tend to take more career breaks. There is the gender pay gap that exists where a woman with the same qualifications for the same job gets paid anywhere between 15 to 30% less than a male peer.
Which means less money left over for investing. I mean, let's be clear about what that means.
Absolutely. Right? So you're earning less. Healthcare costs more for a woman over the course of her life.
Do you realize, I was listening to something, sorry to interrupt you, but I was reading or listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, and they said that not the Center for Disease Control, but like the National Health Institute in the United States didn't do any female-specific health research or medical care research until like 2010.
Yeah, and the majority of the pharmaceutical drugs that are approved right now, they were not tested in women.
Yeah, that's
so because of that, the majority of the side effects are on us.
But again, that gets back to the financial world. And again, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but if you look at it through that lens, it just means that the whole thing that finance impacts as well as health impacts is going to be completely different. Sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely. And sorry, just talking about products, even new age products, I hear that VR glasses actually cause women to throw up when they're like close to their menstrual cycle or something, right? This was probably not a test case ever.
I can't imagine that going through like,
right.
Yeah.
And so, and I mean, we go through our menstrual cycles every month. So anyway, this is just a side, I don't know if it's a fun fact, it's a fact. But yeah, healthcare costs more for women. You earn less over the course of your life. Women tend to outlive men. That's a fact,
That's
right?
A fact, yeah.
And so you have to plan for longer retirements. And so basically you're earning less. You're spending more, and you need that money to last you longer. Right? And so and financial goals do differ for women, right? Women look at risk a little differently than men do. Not that women are super risk averse. That tends to be the stereotype. But we've seen that women are far more risk aware, right?
I think this idea that women are risk averse is actually kind of funny. You know, when a man goes on a date, the biggest thing he worries about is, can he get the next date?
Right.
And when a woman goes on a date, the biggest thing she worries about is, am I going to get killed?
Yes.
That is so true.
Right? Am I going to survive
Yeah,
this,
like
right?
all your friends know where you're going.
Exactly.
Like location sharing.
So who's the risk averse one here? Anyway, so in this context, with, you know, now women like completely, and not completely, but way more in the workforce than they were 50 years ago, and all of the life differences that they have. How does Basis look at this, and how big is this opportunity?
Right. So, yes, financial services needs to be reimagined for women, right? This is on the consumer front, but also for women-run businesses. In India alone, we've estimated the market to be anywhere between $30 to $35 billion. This is just money being left on the table across financial services, whether we're looking at insurance products, wealth, credit, etc. Globally, this is estimated to be a $700 billion market.
So tiny is what you're saying.
It's just a tiny little niche market is what many people call it. And yeah, if insurance was sold to women in the proportions that it needs to be, if women were investing, if credit products were targeting women effectively, this is the size of the market.
So is this true in developed markets as well, that women are underinsured in comparison to men?
So for now, it really depends, because in a lot of developed markets, people get their main insurances from their work.
Right.
So they get health insurance and life insurance from work. So the basic coverage is there, and also because the government covers people differently. But when you think about voluntary products, then that would be the case.
That's what I want to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
really
also talking about, like, let's say health insurance from work, the type of coverage is tiny, right? In an Indian context, at least, I'm not an expert in other markets, but you need to get your independent covers, because if like a medical emergency can bankrupt you, and just saying like, hey, I have like a basic cover from work, or I'm on a family plan along with my husband,
right.
That should, work for us all, is actually, I mean, it's not good, right?
But you mentioned about being risk aware, and I think when you think about insurance, that's exactly the case. Because you might have the impression, I am covered.
Right.
Yes.
But covered for what?
Yeah.
And I think our role as insurers, right, not only in the health space, but this is one obvious example, right, is making people understand what they're buying. Because products can be very, very complicated, right? And when we think about women, there are certain things that are specific to women. I'll give you an example, right? In a previous employer I had, I mean, every new year, you would look at your coverages and select, right? Okay, do I want to have just the basic coverage, or do I want to do a pop-up, etc.? And I could check what price it would be if I was a man. So it would be cheaper for me if I was a man, if I get the basic coverage, because as a woman in my age, I can reproduce. But I'm like, okay, I understand, right? I understand that I'm a woman. I know that. Okay?
Why is that a problem?
However, typically it needs two to make one. Shouldn't we be, quite honestly, sharing that cost across?
Interesting.
I understand we're talking about risk pool, right? However, we should be sharing across. And if we think a risk pool of any employer, even though, of course, there are many more women in the workplace, right? there still tends to be either more men or more men in higher end positions, therefore more men collecting higher value premiums. So in the total pool, if I share this top up that you're giving to every female, it's not going to hurt this man. And these are the ones making the babies. Hello, right? So I think there's also inequality with that perspective, right? It's not only about the environment of work, giving parental leave instead of maternal leave and paternal leave, but it's also designing products in a way that reproduction is not only a women's problem or a women's issue.
Or a tax.
That's correct. Shouldn't be a
Right.
tax for us. We should be sharing this. But I think it's a societal change that has to happen for that perspective as well.
Yeah, and I like to try to imagine like being in the room when the meeting takes place, whatever the meeting is, right? So if you have a bunch of people in the room saying, okay, we have to have basic cover for women, and just based on history and all this data that we have, the cost has to be a little bit higher. And everyone in the room, yeah, it makes sense because the payout's going to be this, without anybody going, yeah, but if the expensive part is the child rearing part, somebody else has to be in. Like, I just can't imagine that happening in the meeting. It
That's
has to
correct.
happen.
It has to happen, but I think this is where representation matters as well. Because if it's a decision-making forum where you have just men or women that had to change their behavior to be more male-like to be there, nobody's going to say anything because you're risking something, right? So I think it's about empathy in design, and I'm pretty sure you have applied that to your products. Would be great to hear. But this is something that we have to have, right?
Yeah. And sorry, speaking of insurance too, something like vehicle or car insurance could actually be priced better for women because women are known to be safer drivers. And moms are, data has shown that moms are even safer, right? So could
Yeah,
we...
because they're worried about the package in the back. Yeah,
your sort of risk radar is just very different.
Right.
So could we create like, women-specific car insurance or women-specific vehicle insurance that's priced better and from a risk standpoint works out better for the insurer as well.
Can you talk about an investment product for me, or just investment products at scale? Because of the differences in kind of the life patterns, right? Whether it's chunky earnings and then time off for whatever reason, right? How does that impact the way you design financial services and investment products? I'm super curious.
Right. So women fundamentally look for different things in investment products.
Okay.
There is this book called Warren Buffett Invests Like a Girl, which I think you should check out. But it talks about his feminine traits that make him, I guess, the world's greatest investor. But so women look more at long term, right? Women tend to trade less, invest more.
Right.
Yeah.
And even when a woman says she's a high growth investor, for instance, she is looking fundamentally for some amount of liquidity in her portfolio as well, right? So this is something she's expecting from her advisor. Risk, of course, we talked about, just more risk aware. Women tend not to put their money into something they don't fully understand.
Right. So this is the Dairy Queen investment.
Right.
From Warren Buffett. He was
Right.
like, it's ice cream.
Right.
It's cyclical. People buy more ice cream in the summer. When it's hot, it's very simple. Like, it's not a complicated business. It's not tech. And I get it.
Right.
Sorry. So
yeah,
same
so
thing,
this
right?
is one of
That idea.
those traits that's
Right.
mentioned in the book. So yes, I'm not gonna like blindly follow the herd, which is great as an investor, which is why even with the crypto boom and bust and whatever happened, I think women were affected less in a good way. Yes, I think getting contextual information, the right amount of detail, getting their questions answered. So in our community, we had questions like, I'm putting my money into a mutual fund. What happens if the fund manager leaves? Which I think is a great question, but I'd never seen it asked anywhere, right? So, those are types of things that women think about that you need to factor in, not only to into the user experience of your product, but then also, the types of products, like financial goals. Of course, there are the typical ones like want to buy a home, want to buy a car, want to save for my kids' education. But there are also financial goals like a career break, which is not, on the face of it, it doesn't seem like a financial goal.
So do you think earlier on in a woman's life, she's thinking about that career break and thinking maybe I oversave and overinvest early? Do you know what I mean? Because that would change the structure of a financial product. We talked about it again offline. Your discounted cash flow calculation, right? How much it's going to take to get to this? How much do I have to invest earlier? Does that change as well?
So of course, I mean, that's where financial goal planning, et cetera, plays in, right? So we had a career break calculator on our app.
Do you really?
Yes.
Okay,
which
so you're
was-
doing it.
We're doing
That's
it.
kinda cool.
And it was, I mean, I don't know if any men cared about it, but the women, they were like, this is the first time we're actually seeing something like this. And yes, I may want to take a break. I maybe have a couple of years to get there and I want to take a year or two off. How do I structure my savings and investments so that I don't have to ask someone for an allowance or something during that period, right? So it is a financial event. And I think these sorts of things need to be taken into account when you're designing investment products.
So we talked before about financial independence, right? I mean, you talked about this a lot. As part of your community building, as part of your financial literacy education, right? Do you talk about you just need to be financially independent? Is that part of this strategy? Should it be?
I mean, the end
Because you just said, like, you don't want to have to ask somebody for,
right.
What did you say, a stipend, an allowance? An allowance.
Yeah. So I think financial independence, the definition differs for people, right? It's not just about, I don't know, for some people it's having a lot of money. For some people it's about whatever, freedom to pick what you want to do. Amounts may differ person to person.
Sure.
But of course, the end goal is financial independence, right? You have the autonomy to do whatever it is you want to do. It could be start a business. It could be getting married or not.
Right.
It could be having kids. It could be anything, like doing an MBA, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that is the goal, where the dependence on anyone, right? It could be, and it usually for a woman ends up being a male member in the family, your father, before you get married, maybe your husband after, which
right.
tends to be the case. But yeah, the end goal is financial independence and being able to pursue whatever it is you want to. I often talk about these 4 Ds in a woman's life.
Go for it.
Which I mean, in a human's life, but disproportionately impacts women. Divorce, death of a spouse,
Right.
A disaster like we saw play out with COVID, and debt, right? These are sort of crippling financial events. And I remember posting about this or talking about it on another podcast. My dad heard that. He sends me a text saying, he did. He listened to it. He sent me a text saying, can you add a 5th D called dreams? Right? And I was so, it's dreams. You want to finance your dream. He's like, all of your examples were very negative.
I want to meet your dad.
Right. And he's like, you should add a 5th D to that. So yes, divorce, debt, disaster, death of a spouse, and your own dreams.
And dreams, yeah. Yeah, because it's the, sorry, go ahead.
No, but I'm just saying that actually, well, just coming back to the career break situation, I think this is so important because we know that in a way or another, if you have children, your career is going to decelerate. It might not be the case that you're breaking that career or you plan to do it, but the majority of women that I know, the moment they have kids, things change. They come to a different income bracket. They cannot get that promotion. Things really change. So I think this part has to be planned as well because, and awareness has to be raised. Of course, things need to change, and I hope they change over time. But right now, that's the world we live in, and we have to plan for it for now. But I think over time, in the next generations, I see that happening, right? The younger generations, they want voluntarily to take that career break because they don't have the same values as the others. And this might be male or female, at least in more developed countries. They're rethinking what work is, what's the value of their time, right? And that this also makes sense in their overall life planning, right? So I think this is going to become even more important, not only for women today, but for everyone down the line.
So you've used this word a couple of times, normalize. And I want to use it in the context of this experience that you talked about in the Nordics, right? Because you just said, after a woman has children, again, which I don't think happens in a vacuum. I've never seen that. And if anybody says it happens, I kind of don't believe it, but we can talk about that again offline. But if you're having kids, you're having them generally with somebody, at least at the beginning, right? But if your career decelerates, it's maybe more from perception about what your effort's going to be or all those other kinds of things. But if you normalize this idea around parental leave, not paternity leave, not maternity leave, but parental leave, then you can take a break. Your partner can take a break, husband or not, doesn't matter, right? If that's normalized, so maybe you can talk about this experience you had in the Nordics where you were just like, yeah, he's the father kind of thing.
That's correct, because we see, and the data shows, right, that in the Nordics, there is more equality between men and women. And one of the key points is this, is normalizing parental leave, normalizing the men are also part of the child equation.
There's another parent.
That's correct. Right? That's correct. And I think this also changes for an employer's perspective, right? To say, hey, I have both men and women, and both men and women may leave to pursue their family objectives.
Yeah.
Let's just make that normal. Because today, even just to be clear, I'm not looking for a new job. But if I was to look for a new job because of my age, I wouldn't put that on my CV.
You wouldn't put what on your CV?
My age or my date of birth. Because if they infer how old I am, there's a big tag in my face, kid.
So it's really strange that you say this, because I live on LinkedIn, right? I live on LinkedIn. And when you look down at the bottom where it says education, almost every guy will put down the year he graduated from school. And almost every gal will not.
Yes. This is part of the equation, because you don't want to be perceived. And it's a very sad thing, right? Because raising a family is something that is valid for everyone, right?
For everybody.
But you don't want to be perceived as someone who is pursuing that, because your chances will go down.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's
and
just
it
a
affects,
fact.
yes, work. I mean, even as women entrepreneurs, that is a big factor, right? I fundraised for Basis pregnant.
Please tell me you were pregnant. I love it. I love it.
And I was so glad that it was during COVID and that we were in a lockdown and all my calls were on Zoom.
Wait
so no one
so
could see.
They couldn't see you.
They couldn't see below my torso or whatever.
Did you actively make sure that was the case? Do you know what I mean?
I mean,
did you think about it?
I did think about it. I was like, what if people see my pregnant belly, right? Could that impact how they view how serious I'm going to be about building and scaling this company?
Right.
And I think it was a valid thought, because I'd heard stories from women saying, and they get asked these questions. I think younger women get asked questions around, so when do you plan to get married?
Right.
If you're slightly older and, it's just like, okay, you're married, when do you plan to have kids? And so it impacts like regular job interviews, but also as a woman fundraising for her company or startup. I have another story from another woman entrepreneur in India, and she didn't, I guess, have the fortune of raising when everything was virtual. And she said she wore really loose clothes through her Series A fundraise, so nobody would realize she was pregnant. And this is actually a big topic. We have a female founders group. It's a WhatsApp group of many founders, and it's one of the biggest topics on the group. Like, want to start a family? Who's done it? How have you gone about it? Did you fundraise? Et cetera, right? So it matters.
Let me give you a reverse perspective that probably no one's ever said to you before. I sat on a trading desk, right? So we were constantly interviewing people and trying to hire people. And it was said out loud, right, in private meetings, she's this age, so probably going to get married soon. But just think about it. So it's not just like it's not happening. It's not just something that you think is happening.
Right.
It's just when you're not there.
It is, absolutely.
That's what's happening.
And oftentimes, even if you're there, I think people start getting used to it, because I'm single, right? So I've already heard things because people are comfortable enough to tell me this.
Right.
But I'm like, I prefer to know what is said.
Right,
but not that I agree with that. And of course I'm going to push back, right? That's not correct.
But I'll just add one more point here is I don't think, I think women are also guilty for many things, and that's where the unlearning has to happen. It's not like, okay, I'm going to get married and that's the end of my career and I'm going to move wherever my partner is, or now that I have a kid, it's like, of course the kid takes priority over everything else in my life.
Right.
So I think that unlearning has to happen across all genders.
I agree, and I'll tell you this, I've heard tons of stories in the startup world of women going to raise money while they were pregnant and female investors just going, yeah, sorry, no.
Yeah, it's across the board. I think we, as a community, as a society, need to change how we think.
Do you think there are policy and regulatory frameworks that need to change? And are you, does Basis not actively work on it, but do you consider that?
So I don't actually believe policy or regulation will solve for this, right? I almost... I feel like the changes need to be more organic to be more long-term sustainable.
Yep.
I've never been a fan of quotas and things like that, because that almost tends to work against you.
Yeah.
As, you got in here because
of this.
Of that,
whatever,
not because of your competence or capabilities.
Right.
But I do think subtler things can help. Like in India, there's a law by the Companies Act that says every listed company needs to have at least one director, an independent director on your board who has to be a woman.
Okay. Right?
Which, I don't know, it could be a good thing. I think it's a newish rule, so we'll wait and see. But I feel like if there are more women in those decision-making spots, then that could change how companies are built, how products are built, how business decisions are made.
So we talked a little bit about, and I'll let you guys go in a little bit, right? But there's a few more things I just want to cover. So we talked a little bit about Epic Angels, right, beforehand. And one of the things that Micah Doyer and I spoke about was she's very passionate about lowering the threshold for the amount of money you need to have for your net worth to be able to invest in startup companies.
Right.
Right. Because again, because women earn in chunks and then maybe take a break, or maybe because they're just the way their finances are set up, they may not have as much money. And that taking away the possibility for them to invest that money and earn 10 times or 20 times their money feels regulatorily that needs to change.
Right.
Right. So that's something I think that where regulations can fix things.
Like lowering the barriers
for everybody.
Yeah.
Right. But it may uniquely or fundamentally help women be able to invest in startup companies, which I think is not a bad thing. Is there a tech angle here? Do you know what I mean? In other words, is there a way that tech is applied to financial services that maybe should be different for women than it is for men? Or is that not necessarily the case?
I mean, I think digital financial services is changing the game for everyone, right? Like access has never been easier. Scale has never been easier. So I think from that standpoint, financial inclusion is just getting accelerated thanks to technology and like banks on your mobile phone. And it also enables you to personalize experiences in ways you couldn't do before.
Absolutely.
Right? So when a woman logs into her bank app or her fintech app, the things she sees, the information she sees, the product she sees, sort of actually cater to her. So I think all of that is happening with tech. There are also other things, like I recently heard, as part of getting onboarded or opening a new account, either a bank account or like a prepaid card account in India, you have to go through a video KYC, right? So it's not only about like giving your like ID numbers and running a bunch of KYC. The person has to see you're alive and you are where you are. And women actually don't like taking these calls after 8 o'clock at night because it's usually a male agent on the other end.
Right.
And so I don't know, there are those nuances that you can actually fix quite easily. Of course, you'd have to hire a bunch of women agents. In fact, for our product, that was one of our requirements from our KYC provider. We're like, okay, you are offering this to us. So can we make sure every single time it's a woman on the other end?
Because the client's going to be a lady.
Client's going to be a lady, and we want her to feel comfortable, right? So I think those are things we can do very easily. We can experiment faster. I think technology is what is enabling all of this.
Okay, one last thing. What's the one thing you want people to know about Basis?
Oh, I want people to know a lot about Basis. I'll have to think about. I mean, the one thing is where I want to say changing the game for women and money. And I think from an industry standpoint, we are creating a new category within financial services.
Feels like it.
And we're opening up the market, right? Because it's a lot of people are like, well, you're going to compete with neobank X and Y and consumer fintech app ABC, but these users are not using those products today, right? So we're basically expanding the industry, and that's what I want people to see globally. This is a global problem.
And also, if you're designing from the ground up, from scratch, to make it a female-focused, fundamentally female-focused financial services app, for somebody who's built, whether it's a neobank or even an existing financial services company, for them to bolt on the same experience, at least in my mind, it's going to be so hard to almost be impossible. Right. So you're creating a brand new category.
If it's not in your DNA, it is very hard.
Right, which is why like a flip phone could never compete with the iPhone.
Yes.
Because fundamentally you couldn't put all the things there that were on an iPhone. Anyway, I want to thank both of you for doing this. Isabella Carvalho, the digital head, oversees general insurance at Chubb, and Hena Mehta, a co-founder and CEO at Basis. Awesome. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.